The congressional hearing room grew silent as Mark Levin, the conservative radio giant, known for his booming voice and deep constitutional knowledge, leaned toward his microphone. His sharp gaze, framed by his glasses, locked on Representative Jasmine Crockett across the chamber. What followed over the next 30 seconds would become one of the year's most viral political moments, leaving millions to wonder if the veteran broadcaster had just been outmatched by a first-term congresswoman. Before we dive into this tense exchange, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell, because what you're about to see is political debate in its purest form. This wasn't just another hearing, it was the collision of two sharp legal minds, a moment that would challenge reputations and shape new ones. The anticipation had been building for weeks. Mark Levin, often called the Great One in conservative media, had been invited to testify before the House Judiciary Committee on constitutional interpretation and executive power. For decades, Levin dominated the airwaves with his commanding tone, sharp arguments, and ability to dismantle opposing viewpoints. His best-selling books and commentaries had influenced public opinion and even Supreme Court discussions, earning him a place as a leading conservative legal thinker. Across from him sat Representative Jasmine Crockett of Texas's 30th District. At first glance, she seemed an unlikely challenger, young, relatively new to Congress, and without the decades of media experience Levin wielded. But those who knew her background understood that behind her composed demeanor was a formidable legal mind forged in Texas courtrooms, where real lives hung in the balance. The hearing was expected to be straightforward. Levin would discuss constitutional originalism, field easy questions from Republicans, handle a few challenges from Democrats, and walk away with another clip for his show. But when Crockett adjusted her microphone and fixed her gaze on him, the tone shifted instantly. "Mr. Levin," she began, her voice calm and measured. "Before we start, I want to ensure we're clear on credentials. You've written extensively on constitutional law, correct?" Levin's lips curled into the confident smirk familiar to his listeners, the same look he gave before dismantling someone on air. He didn't yet realize he was stepping into a carefully prepared exchange that would soon have the entire internet watching his response. To understand the significance of what unfolded, it's important to know who these two figures were. Mark Levin wasn't just another commentator. He was considered conservative royalty. With a law degree from Temple University, service in the Reagan administration, and books like Liberty and Tyranny and American Marxism, Levin had built his reputation as a legal philosopher for the right. Millions tuned in daily to hear him analyze complex issues with absolute confidence. His signature style often involved mocking the legal education of his critics, saying things like, "These people wouldn't know the Constitution if James Madison himself explained it." His show clips frequently went viral, showing him ridiculing what he called pretend lawyers or affirmative action law degrees. His followers admired his intellect and combative wit. When Levin spoke about the law, conservatives listened. But Jasmine Crockett was far from an ordinary new member of Congress. Before her election, she had worked as a civil rights attorney and public defender in Texas, standing in courtrooms where every argument could mean freedom or imprisonment. A graduate of the University of Houston Law Center, she brought years of direct experience applying the law, not just debating it. Unbeknownst to many, Crockett had spent weeks preparing for this hearing. Her team had compiled clips of Levin belittling legal professionals, especially women of color, and had mapped his rhetorical habits and blind spots. She studied his methods carefully, recognizing that his greatest strength, his confidence, could also be his downfall. The stakes were far greater than a routine exchange. This was about who had the credibility to interpret the Constitution in modern America. It was about whether established conservative voices could continue dismissing newer, diverse perspectives without challenge. And it was about whether Levin's trademark intellectual dominance could withstand scrutiny from someone who had practiced law in real courtrooms. For Levin, it was meant to be another routine appearance, a chance to reinforce his image as the conservative movement's leading legal mind. He had no idea he was facing someone who had built her expertise through real-world practice, not studio debates. The hearing room was packed, C-SPAN cameras rolled as reporters from both sides filled the gallery. Conservative media hoped for clips of Levin dismantling liberal arguments, while progressive outlets anticipated a rare pushback. On social media, anticipation grew. Levin vs. Crockett began trending before the questioning even began. Behind Levin sat a team of researchers armed with binders of constitutional citations and quotes from the Founding Fathers. Behind Crockett sat a single aide with an iPad. She didn't need a large staff. She had preparation, courtroom experience, and a plan to turn Levin's overconfidence into his biggest weakness. The first several minutes unfolded predictably. Levin answered questions with ease, quoting the Federalist Papers and referencing historical context from memory. Republican members gave him space to showcase his expertise. He was in his comfort zone, performing for the cameras much like on his nightly radio show. Then it was Jasmine Crockett's turn. "Mr. Levin," she began in a professional but firm tone that made everyone lean in, "you've been outspoken about the quality of legal education in the US. In fact, just last month on your show you said, and I quote, 'Half these Democrats couldn't pass a first-year constitutional law exam if their life depended on it.' Do you recall saying that?" Levin adjusted his glasses, a familiar signal to his audience that he was ready to go on the offensive. "I say a lot on my show, Congresswoman, but yes, I stand by my belief that many politicians today lack a real grasp of our constitutional system." "I see," Crockett replied, calmly sorting through her papers. "You've also said repeatedly that some law schools are, quote, degree mills, handing out participation trophies instead of real education. Is that also accurate?" The room quieted. Some Republicans shifted uncomfortably. They could sense Crockett was leading somewhere. Levin's voice grew more assertive. "Absolutely. Legal education has deteriorated. When law schools prioritize diversity quotas over academic rigor, when graduates can't even cite a Supreme Court ruling correctly, that's not education. That's a participation trophy." A ripple of murmurs ran through the Democratic side. Younger members exchanged glances. They knew she had gotten Levin to double down. "Interesting," Crockett said, her tone steady despite his remarks. "So you believe you're better qualified to judge someone's legal education and understanding of the law than the state bar associations that license attorneys?" Levin leaned back, looking more confident. "Congresswoman, passing the bar is a basic standard. It doesn't make someone a constitutional expert. I've forgotten more about constitutional law than most lawyers ever learn." That's when Crockett shifted. She pulled out a thick folder, opening it deliberately so the cameras could see. "Mr. Levin, let's test that theory. You attended Temple University Law School, correct?" "Correct. Class of 1980. I worked in the Reagan administration and in private practice for several years." "Several years, I see. When was the last time you actually argued a case in court? Not discussed one on the radio, but stood before a judge to defend a client's rights or liberty?" The room fell silent except for the hum of the C-SPAN cameras. Levin hesitated, his expression tightening. "My experience in the Reagan administration, I didn't ask about your political appointments, Mr. Levin," she interrupted smoothly. "When was the last time you filed a brief under deadline because your client's freedom depended on it? When did you last handle a case where one procedural error could cost someone their life?" "This is absurd," Levin snapped, his temper breaking through. "My credentials speak for themselves. I've written 7 best-selling books on the Constitution." "Books?" Crockett interjected sharply, her timing precise. "You've written books. I've stood in courtrooms saving lives. You talk about the law on the radio. I've practiced it. You mock others' education from behind a microphone, while I've used mine to defend the innocent. So tell me, Mr. Levin, do you believe years of commentary make you more qualified to speak on the law than those who've actually practiced it?" Levin's face flushed red, his hands gripping the table. "My record speaks for itself. I've influenced more legal thought than your record ever could." Crockett began removing documents from her folder. "Let's discuss your record. On January 15th, you said on your show that Marbury versus Madison was fundamentally about judicial restraint. Would you like to correct that statement now, or should I explain to the committee why that's entirely wrong?" Several legal experts in the audience gasped. Any first-year law student knew Marbury versus Madison established judicial review, not restraint. Levin stammered, That's out of context. On February 22nd, Crockett continued, refusing to pause. You claimed the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause was never meant to cover voting rights. Should I cite the 1866 congressional record to prove otherwise, or would you prefer to amend that statement? Democrats struggled to suppress smiles. Even some Republicans looked uneasy. On March 10th, you said there's no constitutional basis for executive agencies to issue regulations. Have you ever read Chevron v. Natural Resources Defense Council? Because I can quote it if you'd like. Each statement landed like a precise blow. These weren't opinions. They were factual errors no practicing lawyer would make. Levin tried to interrupt, his voice rising into the shout his listeners knew well. This is an ambush, Crockett cut through firmly. You've spent years mocking others' legal education. You've questioned whether certain lawyers earned their degrees. You've even implied some of us are only here through affirmative action. So I'm asking you to demonstrate this superior legal knowledge you claim to have, unless, of course, you can't. Levin froze. If he tried to respond, he risked more mistakes. If he stayed silent, he looked defeated. Let's try something simpler, Crockett said evenly, her tone now almost sympathetic. Can you explain the difference between a motion in limine and a motion for summary judgment? Basic tools any active attorney uses regularly. Levin opened his mouth, but no answer came. He understood the concepts loosely, but the procedural specifics eluded him. When was the last time he had truly considered courtroom practice? Crockett pressed on. What's the standard for ineffective assistance of counsel under Strickland versus Washington? Every public defender knows this by heart. Our clients' lives depend on it. But you wouldn't know that, would you? Because you've never held someone's future in your hands. You've never needed to know the law so thoroughly that a single mistake could send an innocent person to prison for decades. The balance of power in the room shifted completely. The man who entered as a towering conservative legal figure was now shrinking in his seat, his face caught between anger and embarrassment. Do you want to talk about participation trophies, Mr. Levin? Crockett's tone rose with measured passion that instantly commanded the room. Your entire media career is a participation trophy. You pretend to be a legal expert because you went to law school 40 years ago and dabbled in politics. Meanwhile, people like me, who actually practice law, who stand in courtrooms and fight for justice, have to listen to you question our credentials, our intelligence, our right to speak on the law. She lifted another document, its pages lined with highlights. This is a transcript from your show dated April 5th, where you said, and I quote, "These diversity hire lawyers wouldn't last 5 minutes in a real legal debate with someone who actually knows the Constitution." Well, Mr. Levin, we've been here for 15 minutes, and you haven't answered a single substantive legal question correctly. So tell me, who's the diversity hire now? The room erupted. Democratic members burst into applause before the Republican chair struck the gavel for order. But the damage was irreversible. Mark Levin, the self-styled conservative legal mind, had just been dismantled on national television by a freshman congresswoman he had casually dismissed moments earlier. And Crockett wasn't finished. "Mr. Levin, I'll give you one more chance to redeem yourself," she continued calmly. "One simple question any first-year law student could answer. It's so basic it appears on the bar exam. Can you explain the doctrine of incorporation and how the Bill of Rights applies to state governments through the 14th Amendment?" This was Constitutional Law 101, material any serious constitutional commentator should master. The entire chamber went silent. Levin began to respond, his voice stripped of its usual authority. "The doctrine of incorporation. It's about how the Bill of Rights through the 14th Amendment." He stumbled. Levin, who had spent years lecturing America about the Constitution, could not give a coherent explanation. "Allow me to help," Crockett said, her tone now almost sympathetic. "The doctrine of incorporation is the legal principle by which the Bill of Rights, originally applicable only to the federal government, is extended to the states through the due process clause of the 14th Amendment. This can occur through selective incorporation, which is the standard approach, or total incorporation. The Supreme Court has applied this in landmark cases like Gitlow versus New York for free speech, Mapp versus Ohio for search and seizure, and McDonald versus Chicago for the Second Amendment. This isn't advanced legal theory, Mr. Levin. We teach it in week 2 of constitutional law. The silence that followed was absolute. Even Republican members averted their eyes. Levin had been publicly and decisively exposed. Yet Crockett had one more point to make. She held up another document for the cameras. This is my law degree, Mr. Levin, from the University of Houston Law Center, a school you've mocked on your show as second tier. This is my bar certification from the state of Texas, something you haven't maintained in decades. Hand these, she said, holding up a stack of papers, are case records, people I've defended, appeals I've argued, lives I've helped change. Real legal work, not commentary, not theater, actual law. She leaned forward, her voice steady and resolute. You see, Mr. Levin, the difference between you and me isn't that you went to Temple and I went to Houston. It's not that you're white and I'm black, or that you're a man and I'm a woman. The difference is that I'm a lawyer, a real lawyer who practices law every day. You're a radio host who used to be a lawyer 40 years ago and has lived off that credential ever since, all while questioning the qualifications of those who still do the work. The weight of her words hung heavy in the air. So the next time you mock someone's law degree or call attorneys like me diversity hires or participation trophies, remember this moment. Remember that when you finally faced a real lawyer, someone who actually knows the law, you couldn't answer questions any first-year student would recognize. Levin made one last attempt to recover. This is character assassination, he muttered. No, Mr. Levin, Crockett replied firmly. This is what happens when arrogance replaces substance. When having a platform is mistaken for having expertise. When someone who truly knows the law finally calls your bluff. She gathered her papers with calm precision, like an attorney concluding a winning case. No further questions, Mr. Chairman. I believe Mr. Levin's qualifications to speak on constitutional matters have been made clear for the record. The gavel struck, though formality was all that remained. Everyone in the chamber knew they had witnessed something remarkable. Mark Levin, once revered for his supposed legal intellect, had been exposed as exactly what critics long suspected. A man living off decades-old credentials while disparaging those actively upholding justice. As Levin sat motionless, his face flushed with anger and humiliation, the cameras captured every second. His staff behind him looked stunned. They had expected viral clips of their boss owning the libs. Instead, they watched his credibility collapse live on air. The Republican chair, once an ally, called for a brief recess, but couldn't bring himself to meet Levin's eyes. Conservative media figures in the audience were already on their phones, some scrambling to spin the story, others quietly distancing themselves from what was clearly a disaster. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett stood, adjusted her blazer, and exited the committee room with quiet, unshakable confidence, the composure of someone who didn't need to gloat. She had already made her point, and in doing so changed the game entirely. She didn't celebrate. She had accomplished what she came to do, expose a fraud who had spent years belittling people like her. And she did it using only facts, law, and the kind of preparation that comes from real legal experience. As she passed Levin's table, she paused briefly. "Mr. Levin," she said quietly, but clearly enough for microphones to catch, "I'll be tuning into your show tonight. I'm curious to see how you'll spin this, though based on today's performance, I'm not sure you understand what spin means in a legal sense either." The remark landed with surgical precision. Levin opened his mouth as if to reply, but nothing came out. For the first time in his career, Mark Levin was speechless. Within minutes of the recess, the clip was everywhere. Crockett destroys Levin, shot to the top of social media trends faster than any recent political moment. The video of Crockett systematically dismantling Levin's supposed expertise spread across every platform. Progressive commentators called it the most satisfying political takedown in years. Even some conservative voices conceded that Levin had been unprepared and thoroughly outmatched. The first major outlet to cover the story was Politico, with a headline that quickly became infamous. "The Great One fumbles Mark Levin struggles with basic legal questions in catastrophic testimony." The piece detailed each of Levin's missteps, supported by fact checks from constitutional law professors confirming Crockett's corrections were accurate. CNN's legal analyst Jeffrey Toobin tweeted, "In 30 years of covering legal affairs, I've never seen a more complete intellectual dismantling in Congress. Crockett didn't just win, she exposed that Levin doesn't understand the law he claims to teach. Even Fox News, Levin's ideological base, found it difficult to defend him. On The Five, Greg Gutfeld awkwardly remarked, "Sometimes you just have bad days." Jesse Watters quickly shifted topics to immigration, while Sean Hannity tried to defend Levin, accusing Crockett of ambushing him with gotcha questions. But even his tone lacked conviction. The strongest criticism came from within the legal community. Professors and lawyers who had stayed silent about Levin for years began speaking out. Harvard Law's Lawrence Tribe posted a thread dissecting Levin's errors, calling it a case study in what happens when punditry replaces real legal understanding. Yale Law's Akil Amar, known for his moderate views, wrote, "For years, Levin has attacked others' credentials while masking himself in false constitutional authority. Representative Crockett just did the legal field a favor by exposing that. Perhaps most damaging was the quiet backlash from conservative legal circles. Members of the Federalist Society privately admitted that they'd long known Levin was more entertainer than scholar, but found him too useful to challenge. One conservative attorney told the Daily Beast, "We've all cringed when Levin gets basic legal principles wrong on air, but his platform was too large to confront." Crockett did what we should have done long ago. That evening, Levin's radio show became must-listen programming, for all the wrong reasons. Millions tuned in to hear his response. Would he acknowledge his mistakes or issue an apology? Instead, he spent the first hour ranting about radical left ambush tactics and disrespect for conservatives. He ignored the factual corrections Crockett had made, and never addressed his constitutional missteps. Rather, he resorted to personal attacks, calling Crockett unqualified and claiming she'd been coached by left-wing academics. The backlash was immediate. Even his longtime listeners began pushing back. One caller from Texas said, "Mark, I've listened to you for 15 years, but she was right. You couldn't answer her basic questions. How can you call her unqualified when she clearly knows the law better than you?" Levin abruptly cut the caller off and went to commercial. But the damage was spreading fast. His YouTube channel, once filled with loyal fans, was now flooded with timestamps of his past legal errors. Amateur analysts began combing through his archives, uncovering dozens of instances where he misstated basic legal concepts while criticizing others. Conservative media attempted to contain the fallout. Ben Shapiro argued that courtroom experience doesn't equal constitutional expertise, but even his supporters countered that Levin had failed on both fronts. Tucker Carlson tried reframing the controversy as woke culture attacking traditional voices, but that line failed. Crockett had used only evidence and Levin's own words against him. The internet's reaction was ruthless. Mark Levin Law School quickly became slang for pretending to know what you don't. Memes and GIFs of his fumbling spread widely. One viral TikTok showed a law student watching the clip captioned, "This is why you pay attention in constitutional law." Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett's reputation soared. Overnight, she went from a lesser-known freshman representative to a national figure. Her social media following skyrocketed, gaining 500,000 new followers in 2 days. Law schools invited her to speak. MSNBC offered her a legal analyst position. And publishers reached out about potential books. Beyond the attention, she had shifted how legal credibility was perceived in politics. For too long, figures like Levin had claimed expertise through old credentials and loud rhetoric, rather than current practical understanding. Crockett demonstrated that genuine knowledge and preparation could dismantle false authority. Law schools began showing the hearing footage in ethics classes to highlight the risks of overstating legal expertise. The Texas Bar Association praised Crockett for demonstrating the distinction between practicing law and merely talking about it. The Congressional Black Caucus issued a statement noting, "Representative Crockett's precise defense of legal integrity exemplifies why diverse, informed voices in Congress are essential." She brought not only perspective but mastery, exposing the weakness behind her critics' attacks. 3 days after the hearing, something unprecedented occurred. Westwood One, Levin's radio syndicator, announced a format change for his show, shifting from legal commentary to general conservative talk. Industry insiders reported that advertisers had begun withdrawing after the debacle, wary of being associated with someone whose expertise had been publicly discredited. Levin tried to recover by inviting supportive guests, but even they hesitated. When Jay Sekulow appeared to vouch for Levin, he avoided endorsing any of Levin's specific legal claims, instead offering vague praise for his passion for the Constitution. By the following week, the damage was done. The legal community had moved on, and Levin's credibility had been permanently fractured, all because one congresswoman, armed with facts and preparation, refused to be intimidated. A prominent legal journal released an editorial titled "The Crockett Hearing, a Lesson in Legal Competence." Though it didn't mention Levin by name, it emphasized the value of active legal practice in maintaining professional skill and warned of the dangers posed by outdated credentials posing as current expertise. Representative Jasmine Crockett managed her newfound attention with composure and intent. In her first major interview after the hearing with Rachel Maddow, she clarified that her actions were not meant to embarrass Mr. Levin, though she understood why people might see it that way. This was about standing up for every lawyer who's been told their degree wasn't prestigious enough, so their path wasn't traditional enough, often by people who haven't practiced law in decades, she said. Crockett explained that her authority came from real cases, moments when a single procedural mistake could determine whether someone lost their freedom or their children. That's genuine legal work, she added. That's where true expertise comes from, not from a talk show, book sales, or appointments made 40 years ago. The interview quickly went viral, elevating her message beyond the hearing itself. She wasn't boasting. She was teaching, using her platform to challenge outdated notions of expertise and intellectual hierarchy in America. Law schools began reaching out to her for speaking engagements. The University of Houston Law Center, her alma mater, once dismissed by Levin as second tier, reported a 30% surge in applications the week following the hearing. Its dean released a statement praising Crockett. She has shown that the value of a legal education isn't defined by rankings, but by how you use it. Meanwhile, Levin's influence was collapsing. His book sales nosedived, speaking events were cancelled, and former political allies began distancing themselves. Blaze TV chose not to renew his show 2 months later. His attempt to publish an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal was rejected. The editors reportedly concluded he had lost credibility as a serious legal commentator. Within 3 months, a Media Matters report found his radio audience had dropped by 40%, with major stations in Houston, Atlanta, and Philadelphia dropping his show. Podcast downloads fell by 60%. The once dominant legal voice of conservative radio was fading into irrelevance. Yet the broader significance extended far beyond one man's decline. The hearing sparked a national conversation about authenticity and authority. Conservative pundits became more cautious in claiming legal expertise, while progressive commentators, inspired by Crockett's example, began fact-checking legal claims more rigorously. The phrase "pulling a Crockett" entered political vocabulary, meaning to be thoroughly prepared to expose false claims of expertise. Law students studied her questioning as a model of precision and control, and several law schools added her cross-examination to trial advocacy courses. Crockett's legislative work also gained momentum. Bills that had struggled to attract attention suddenly drew new co-sponsors. Her voice carried new authority in committee hearings, and even Republican colleagues began to treat her with increased respect. She had proven herself not just as a politician, but as a deeply capable legal mind. 6 months later, Crockett delivered the keynote address at the National Bar Association's annual convention. Her speech, "The Practice of Law versus the Performance of Law," explored the difference between genuine legal work and performative punditry. Without naming Levin, she spoke to a packed audience. Too often we allow those who perform law on television or radio to be treated as equal to those who practice it in court. We mistake volume for knowledge, confidence for competence, and platforms for expertise. But law is not a performance, it's a practice. It requires continuous study, real-world experience, and engagement with actual consequences. Her speech earned a 5-minute standing ovation. Online, legal communities called it the definitive end of performative legal expertise. Even some conservative attorneys privately admitted she had made a valid point. A year after the hearing, Levin attempted a comeback with a new podcast titled The Real Constitution, promising to set the record straight. The debut episode drew moderate attention out of curiosity, but by the fifth episode, downloads had dropped below 10,000. The man who once commanded millions could no longer sustain a modest audience. The final turn came when the University of Houston Law Center announced the creation of the Jasmine Crockett Chair in Constitutional Practice, funded by donations that poured in after the hearing. The position would support professors who blend theory with real-world experience. At the announcement, Crockett said, "This chair represents the belief that the best legal education unites theory and practice, books and courtrooms, study and experience. It's for those who don't just teach law but live it." The event drew national coverage and attendance from top legal minds across the political spectrum. In contrast, Levin, bitter and sidelined, posted a disparaging tweet about the corruption of legal education by identity politics. It garnered only 47 likes, a stark decline from his once thriving online influence. The transformation was complete. The man who had long portrayed himself as the conservative movement's leading legal authority was now a marginalized figure, shouting into the void. Jasmine Crockett, meanwhile, had risen as one of Congress's most respected legal voices. Her reputation grounded not in bluster or ideology, but in preparation, substance, and integrity. 2 years after that landmark hearing, the effects of what became known as the Crockett Standard continued to shape the legal and political landscape. The cross-examination continued to resonate across American political and legal culture. Law schools began teaching it as a model of precise questioning, while political strategists analyzed it as a blueprint for challenging seemingly untouchable opponents. Media critics marked it as the point when performative expertise started to lose influence in public discourse. Jasmine Crockett soon became the ranking member of the House Judiciary Committee, her legal background making her one of Congress's most respected voices on legal matters. She authored a best-selling book, Practice Over Performance, Reclaiming Expertise in American Life, which became essential reading in law and political science programs. She never forgot the principle that true expertise, grounded in preparation and experience, would always prevail over arrogance and outdated credentials. In every hearing, speech, and interview, Crockett maintained the same careful preparation that had dismantled Mark Levin's credibility. She earned a reputation as one of the most thorough members of Congress, never making a statement she couldn't substantiate. Levin's downfall became a warning throughout conservative media. His name came to symbolize overconfidence and false authority. Young commentators learned the importance of backing every claim with evidence. The era of self-proclaimed experts was giving way to one that demanded genuine knowledge and verifiable experience. The broader legal profession also evolved. The American Bar Association introduced updated continuing education rules, requiring lawyers who appeared in public or media as legal experts to stay current in their fields through active practice or study. Several states followed, warning that publicly claiming legal expertise without maintaining competence could constitute an ethical breach. Gradually, political discourse shifted. Politicians grew more cautious about asserting authority they didn't have, and commentators began referencing real cases and statutes rather than offering vague legal opinions. The bar for credible legal analysis had been raised, and Jasmine Crockett was the reason. Across law schools nationwide, students studied the Crockett hearing as a masterclass in the power of preparation. They learned that knowledge could overcome bias, that facts could defeat fame, and that true expertise always exposed false authority. For young lawyers, especially women and people of color who had often been told their credentials were insufficient, Crockett's victory became a roadmap for success. The profession experienced what many dubbed the Crockett effect. Applications from underrepresented groups surged, and public defender offices saw renewed interest from elite law graduates eager for hands-on experience. The value of practicing law rather than merely discussing it gained new recognition and prestige. Even conservative media adapted. The next generation of right-leaning legal commentators kept their bar licenses active, stayed informed about new rulings, and grounded their commentary in real legal knowledge rather than ideology. Levin's downfall had taught them that in the digital age, misinformation could be instantly exposed and permanently archived. Progressive outlets also learned from the hearing. They recognized the importance of genuine expertise over passion alone. Networks like MSNBC and CNN began seeking out current legal scholars and practicing attorneys instead of relying solely on retired prosecutors or former political appointees. The hearing also reshaped how Congress itself operated. Lawmakers began preparing more rigorously, aware that witnesses might record or verify their questioning later. The overall quality of hearings improved as members could no longer rely on talking points. They had to understand their subjects in depth. 5 years later, Jasmine Crockett stood before the Supreme Court, arguing a landmark case on voting rights. Taking a temporary leave from Congress, she explained that the issue was too important to delegate. As she addressed the 9 justices, observers reflected on her remarkable journey, from a modest law school to Congress to the nation's highest court. Crockett had proven that success was about preparation, knowledge, and integrity, not pedigree. Her decisive exchange with Mark Levin had merely been the beginning of a career that transformed American legal and political dialogue. Standing at the podium, she argued confidently, citing precedent with the mastery of someone who had trained for this moment her entire life. Many in the audience thought back to that hearing years ago, when a young congresswoman had exposed the difference between talking about the law and truly understanding it. Meanwhile, Mark Levin had faded from public life. His radio show was cancelled after plummeting ratings, his book sales collapsed, and his once massive social media following shrank to a small circle of loyal supporters who still claimed he'd been treated unfairly. He became a cautionary example in journalism and communications programs, a study in the consequences of arrogance and the necessity of real expertise. Yet his downfall had meaning. It demonstrated that in an age of transparency, false knowledge could not endure. It reaffirmed that preparation and authentic expertise will always surpass ego and empty authority. The old gatekeepers who relied on reputation instead of substance had been challenged and defeated by those who did the actual work. The result was a stronger, more credible legal community. A new generation of professionals learned a lasting lesson. Authority isn't claimed, it's earned. Not through speeches, but through demonstrated skill. Not by belittling others' credentials, but by proving your own. As Crockett concluded her Supreme Court argument to rare applause from the gallery, she reflected on that pivotal day in Congress, the day she decided to confront false authority head-on. That moment had set a new benchmark for what it meant to be an expert in America. Her standard, grounded in up-to-date knowledge, real-world experience, and disciplined preparation, would shape legal and political culture for decades to come. The message was simple, yet profound. In the contest between performance and practice, between pretended authority and real expertise, truth always prevails. It only requires someone with the courage, preparation, and skill to expose it. Jasmine Crockett was that person, and American discourse was forever changed because of her. If you stayed through this story, you've witnessed one of the defining moments in modern politics. This wasn't just about one congresswoman dismantling a media figure. It was about redefining what true expertise means in America. Like and subscribe for more stories that reveal the truth mainstream media often overlooks. Hit the notification bell so you never miss the next political showdown. And tell us in the comments, did Jasmine Crockett end Mark Levin's career, or was this simply justice served? We read every comment. Until next time, this is your channel for honest, unfiltered political insight.